Story 1. The Stalker in the Woods. I've always been the kind of person who loves a getaway to nature. Back in the summer of 2018, my friends and I decided to rent a lakeside cabin for a weekend. It was one of those spontaneous, last-minute trips we planned in a group chat after a few stressful months at work. There were 5 of us: me, Jamie, Nora, and the twins Alex and Sam. The cabin was perfect, tucked away near a glistening lake with a long wooden dock and surrounded by dense woods that seemed untouched by time. The air smelled like pine and earth, and the only sounds were birds and the gentle lapping of water. It was supposed to be a weekend of BBQs, beer, and badly sung karaoke under the stars. The first day was exactly that: relaxing, fun, and uneventful. But that night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, things started to feel off. It began with the footprints. The cabin had a small gravel path leading down to the dock, and earlier that morning, it had been pristine, just our boot prints from when we unloaded the car. But as we headed down to the lake at dusk to watch the sunset, Jamie stopped dead in his tracks. "Hey, were any of you walking down here barefoot?" he asked, pointing to a line of prints. They were unmistakably fresh, leading from the woods to the water's edge. We all exchanged confused looks. None of us had gone down to the dock that day without shoes, and these prints were large, like a grown man's. We laughed it off, convincing ourselves it must have been an early morning hiker. After all, the area wasn't completely isolated, even if it felt like it. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine as the woods around us began to swallow the remaining light. The first real scare happened later that night. We were all sitting around the fire pit behind the cabin, laughing and swapping ghost stories like you do when you're in the middle of nowhere. The fire cast these long, flickering shadows into the woods, and I kept catching myself glancing into the darkness. That's when Nora froze, her marshmallow stick hovering mid-air. "Do you see that?" she whispered, barely audible over the crackling fire. We all turned to look where she was pointing, just beyond the tree line. At first I thought it was nothing, just shadows playing tricks on us, but then I saw it. A figure half hidden behind a tree watching us. The firelight caught the faintest glint of something reflective, maybe glasses or binoculars, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. "Hey!" Jamie shouted, standing up and taking a step toward the woods. The figure didn't move. It just lingered there, unnervingly still, as if studying us. Sam grabbed a flashlight and pointed it in the direction of the figure, but by the time the beam reached the spot, there was nothing. Just trees and underbrush swaying in the night breeze. "It's probably just some weirdo passing through," Alex said, trying to sound calm, but his voice wavered. We all decided to head back into the cabin after that, locking the doors and pulling the curtains tight. I remember lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was no big deal. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, things felt a little less eerie. Daylight has a way of making even the creepiest experiences seem trivial. Over breakfast, we joked about our mystery stalker, and Jamie went as far as to give him a name: Tree Guy. It felt good to laugh about it, to make it something silly instead of something terrifying. But as we headed outside to enjoy the day, Nora froze again. "Guys," she said, her voice trembling, "you need to see this." She pointed to the side of the cabin, where the ground was soft and damp from last night's dew. There were more footprints, barefoot like the ones by the dock, but this time they circled the cabin. Some were so close to the walls it was as if someone had been pacing, listening in. We tried to shrug it off again, but it was harder this time. Someone had been here while we were asleep. Jamie grabbed a stick and poked around the edge of the woods, muttering about wanting to catch this creep, but nothing came of it. We spent the afternoon together by the lake, but the carefree vibe from before was gone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for movement. Every rustle of leaves felt like a warning. By late afternoon, we decided to stick close to the cabin for dinner. None of us said it outright, but we were scared. The thought of spending another night out there, knowing someone was watching us, sent shivers through all of us. That evening, we decided to eat inside instead of around the fire pit. The cabin felt safer with its solid walls and locked doors, but the atmosphere was tense. Every so often, one of us would glance at the windows as if expecting to see someone staring back. Jamie suggested we play a card game to distract ourselves, and for a little while it worked. We laughed, teased each other, and almost forgot about the footprints. But then there was a sound. A faint, deliberate knock on the window nearest the front door. We all froze. The knock came again, 3 slow, deliberate taps. Jamie grabbed the flashlight and motioned for me to follow him. "Stay here," he told the others, though none of them seemed eager to move anyway. We crept toward the door, every step feeling like an eternity. When Jamie flung the door open and shone the flashlight outside, the beam landed on nothing but the empty porch and the woods beyond. I swear the trees looked like they were closing in, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers. "Who's there?" Jamie called out into the night. No answer, just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. But as we stood there, straining to hear, I caught it, the faint crunch of footsteps retreating into the woods. We locked the door the second we were back inside, double-checking every window latch and even dragging a heavy chair in front of the door for good measure. By now, the mood was completely shot. Nora sat curled up on the couch, gripping a throw pillow like it might save her life, while Alex and Sam stood near the fireplace, whispering about what to do next. "This isn't just some random hiker," Alex finally said, his voice shaking. "Who knocks on a window in the middle of the woods and just disappears?" No one answered. Jamie tried to play it cool, but even he seemed rattled. "Look, whoever it is, they're just messing with us. They probably think it's funny. We'll stick together and we'll be fine." Around midnight, we started to hear the noises. It wasn't loud, just the occasional snap of a branch or crunch of leaves from outside. But it was steady, circling the cabin like someone, or something, was pacing again. The most unsettling part was how deliberate it sounded, like it wanted us to know it was there. We all stayed in the living room, huddled together like kids at a sleepover. I remember every creak of the old wooden floor under our feet, every flicker of the lantern we'd lit when we turned off the main lights to avoid drawing attention. It felt like hours passed that way, just listening, hearts pounding, until Nora whispered, "I think I saw something move." Her words barely broke the silence, but they sent all of us scrambling to check the windows again. This time I saw it too. A shadow just at the edge of the tree line, darting between the trunks. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but it was there. "We need to call someone," Sam said, his voice cracking. "This isn't normal." But when Jamie reached for his phone, he swore under his breath. No signal. Of course. We joked earlier about how disconnected we were out here, how it was part of the charm. Now it felt like a cruel joke. We debated making a run for the car, but the thought of stepping into the woods with that thing, or person, out there made my stomach turn. "We wait until morning," Jamie decided, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We don't go outside until it's light." That's when we heard it, the unmistakable creak of the porch steps. My heart stopped. The cabin had a small front porch, just a few wooden planks and a railing, and now something, or someone, was on it. The sound was painfully slow, each step deliberate, like whoever was out there wanted to make sure we knew they were close. I could see the fear on everyone's faces as we all instinctively backed away from the door. Jamie grabbed the poker from the fireplace, his knuckles white as he held it in front of him. "Whoever you are," he shouted, his voice shaking, "you need to leave now." There was no response, just silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of retreating footsteps down the porch steps and into the woods. None of us slept that night. Every noise, every shadow cast by the dim lantern light felt like a threat. Around 3 a.m. the pacing started again, but this time it was louder. The crunch of leaves was right outside, circling the cabin like a predator stalking prey. Sam finally cracked under the pressure and shouted, "What do you want? Just leave us alone." His voice echoed into the night, but the only reply was more footsteps, deliberate and mocking. They stopped near the side window and we all froze. The sound of heavy breathing came next. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness, it was enough to turn my blood to ice. Someone, or something, was standing just outside watching us close enough to fog up the glass. The breathing stopped suddenly, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, with a deafening crash, something hit the side of the cabin. It was so violent the whole structure seemed to shake. Nora screamed, and Jamie yelled for everyone to stay back. Whoever was outside wasn't just playing games anymore, they were trying to terrify us, and it was working. Jamie moved toward the door, poker still in hand, and motioned for Alex to grab the flashlight. "We can't just sit here," he said. "We need to scare them off." I wanted to stop him, to tell him it was a bad idea, but before I could, he swung the door open and charged onto the porch, yelling into the darkness. For a few seconds I thought it worked. The woods were silent again. But then, from somewhere deeper in the trees, a low, guttural laugh echoed back. The sound of that laugh froze Jamie in his tracks. He stood on the porch, the flashlight beam shaking in his hand, scanning the trees. "Get back inside," Nora hissed, but he didn't move. "Who are you?" Jamie shouted into the woods, his voice cracking with fear and anger. The laugh came again, this time closer, but we still couldn't see anything. It sounded human, but there was something wrong about it, like it didn't belong to a person. Finally, Jamie retreated into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind him. "We need to go now," he said, his face pale. "Whatever that is, it's not normal." But leaving wasn't an option. We weren't about to walk into those woods in the middle of the night, not after hearing that. We decided to wait it out until dawn, sitting together in the living room, weapons, if you could call them that, in hand. The noises outside didn't stop. Whoever was out there kept pacing, occasionally knocking on the windows or walls. Sometimes the laugh would echo again, low and taunting, making it clear we weren't imagining things. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, we were exhausted, but we knew we had to leave. Packing up was frantic and messy. We didn't care about folding clothes or cleaning up. We just wanted to get out of there. The drive back felt like a dream or maybe a nightmare. We didn't talk much, all of us too shaken to process what had happened. As we passed the tree line and finally hit the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the woods watching us leave. But when I blinked, they were gone. I didn't mention it to the others. We were all too fragile to handle anything else. The relief of being back in civilization was overwhelming, but it didn't erase what we'd been through. The feeling of being hunted, watched, it lingered like a shadow following too close. Even now, years later, I think about that weekend. We never figured out who, or what, was out there. Jamie reported it to the local authorities, but they didn't find anything unusual. No footprints, no evidence of someone being around the cabin. Just silence. None of us ever went back to that lake, and I don't think any of us ever will. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I catch myself listening for that laugh, imagining it just outside my window. I know it sounds crazy, but part of me wonders if whoever, or whatever, it was, is still out there waiting for the next group of unlucky visitors to cross its path. All I know is, if you ever find yourself in a cabin in the woods and you see footprints that don't belong to anyone in your group, don't stay to find out who made them. Just leave. Story 2. The Forgotten House Guest. I never thought I'd be the one posting in a forum like this, but what happened to me last spring still sends shivers down my spine. My name is Sarah, and at the time, I was living alone in a modest 2-story house I'd inherited from my grandmother. It was a quiet place tucked away at the edge of town, surrounded by tall oak trees that seemed to whisper in the wind at night. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, so I spent most of my time at home. My life was uneventful, even boring, but I liked it that way. I wasn't the type to scare easily, until the little things started happening. At first, it was so subtle that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. A mug left in the sink when I was sure I'd put it away. A faint creak on the stairs late at night, which I chalked up to the old wood settling. Then there was the food. I noticed my bread seemed to run out faster than usual, and my cereal box was always a little lighter than I remembered. I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just being careless, I told myself. I even joked with a friend over coffee that I must have developed a sleep-eating habit. But deep down, something about it all felt off. The turning point came one night when I was working late on a project. It must have been close to 2 a.m. and the house was deathly quiet. As I was about to shut my laptop, I heard it, a faint scraping sound like something being dragged across the floor. It was coming from above me, from the attic. My stomach dropped, but I froze, telling myself it was just the wind or some animal that had gotten in. Still, the sound continued, sporadic but deliberate, as if someone or something was moving around. I didn't have the courage to check that night, so I turned on every light in the house and slept with a heavy flashlight by my bed. The next morning, I decided to investigate. Armed with a broom, not exactly the most intimidating weapon I know, I pulled down the attic ladder and climbed up slowly, every creak of the steps setting my nerves on edge. The attic was dusty and cramped, full of old furniture and forgotten boxes. I didn't see anything unusual at first, but then I noticed it, a small pile of wrappers tucked behind an old chest. Candy bars, granola, even empty cans of soda. My heart started pounding as I realized these weren't here the last time I cleaned. Someone had been up here. But who? And why? I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it could have been left there by a repairman or someone who had been in the house before I moved in. But the wrappers looked fresh. No dust, no sign of aging. I felt a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. I decided to call my best friend Rachel and tell her what I'd found. She laughed it off, saying, "You're probably just overthinking. Maybe it's mice." But deep down, I knew this wasn't something mice could do. Still, I took her advice and left it alone for a couple of days, hoping the issue would resolve itself. It didn't. The next sign came when I noticed my bedroom door slightly ajar one morning. I always closed it before going to sleep, a habit I'd had since I was a kid. This time it was open just a crack, enough to make my skin crawl. I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. That day, I combed through the entire house, top to bottom, checking every room, closet, and corner. Nothing seemed out of place, but the attic still gnawed at the back of my mind. That's when I spotted it, a faint trail of dust leading to the crawl space in the far corner of the attic. My stomach turned as I realized I hadn't checked there before. It took everything in me to crawl over to that corner. The crawl space was barely large enough to fit a person, but as I shined my flashlight inside, my breath caught. There, nestled between the beams, was a makeshift bed. An old sleeping bag, crumpled and dirty, lay on a flattened cardboard box. Around it were personal items, an empty water bottle, a worn-out pair of sneakers, and a small notebook. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages of the notebook. The writing was erratic, scribbled in a way that felt frantic, almost angry. I couldn't make sense of most of it, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over. "She doesn't know I'm here." I bolted out of the attic and locked the door behind me, my heart racing. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. What if they didn't believe me? What if whoever was living up there came down before they arrived? I decided to spend the night at Rachel's place. As I packed a bag, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow in the house felt alive. Every creak of the floorboards made my skin crawl. I barely slept that night, haunted by the thought that someone had been living under my roof without me knowing. The police came the following morning. I showed them the attic and the crawl space, pointing out the makeshift bed and the personal items. They were thorough, checking every corner of the house and even the surrounding property. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, nodded grimly as he examined the notebook. "It looks like someone's been here for a while," he said. "But whoever it was is gone now. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't." They didn't find any signs of forced entry, which meant whoever had been living there either had a key or had gotten in when I wasn't paying attention. That afternoon, I changed the locks and had a security system installed. For a few days things felt almost normal again, but I couldn't shake the unease. Every night I found myself lying awake, listening for sounds that didn't belong. One night I woke up to a faint tapping noise. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear it again. It was coming from the walls. A slow, deliberate tapping, like someone running their fingers along the drywall. I told myself it had to be the house settling or the wind outside, but deep down I knew better. I wasn't alone. The tapping grew louder over the next few nights, almost as if whoever, or whatever, was behind the walls was getting bolder. I started to dread being in my own home, but I couldn't afford to move, and I was too stubborn to let fear drive me out. One evening, after mustering all the courage I could, I decided to confront the noise. I grabbed a hammer and pried open a section of the wall where the tapping had been the loudest. My hands were shaking, my breath shallow, but I had to know. The hole revealed nothing but insulation and wooden beams. I felt equal parts relief and frustration. Maybe I was losing it. But then, as I was cleaning up the mess, I found something that froze me in place. Stuffed into the insulation was a small piece of paper, yellowed and torn. On it was a crudely drawn sketch of my bedroom. The details were unmistakable: the bed, the dresser, even the lamp on the nightstand. My heart raced as I realized what it meant. Someone had been watching me long enough to memorize the layout of my room. I dropped the paper and stumbled back, the hammer slipping from my hands. I couldn't stay there another night. That night, I stayed at Rachel's again. I couldn't bring myself to explain what I'd found. She already thought I was being paranoid, and I didn't want to scare her. But I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. The sketch, the tapping, the things going missing. It all added up to something I couldn't ignore anymore. The next morning, I decided to hire a professional to inspect the house. A contractor came by and checked every nook and cranny, including the attic and crawl spaces. After about an hour, he came down, his face pale. "You're not going to like this," he said, holding up a small plastic bag. Inside were more items: a toothbrush, a comb, and a phone charger, none of which were mine. That was the last straw. I packed everything I could and moved out that same day, crashing on Rachel's couch until I could figure out my next steps. I contacted the police again, and they promised to investigate further, but the damage was done. I couldn't trust that house or myself anymore. The thought of someone living so close to me, watching me, knowing every detail of my life, was too much to bear. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak, every shadow feels like a warning. Whoever they were gone, but the fear they left behind wasn't. A few weeks after I left the house, the police called with an update. They had found evidence that someone had been living in the attic for months, probably since before I moved in. There were more wrappers, some old clothes, and even a small stash of canned food. The crawl space had a hidden panel leading to an unused vent that opened into the basement. It explained how they'd been moving around without being detected. But the most disturbing part? They found another notebook filled with more sketches. This time it wasn't just my bedroom. There were drawings of me, sitting at my desk, cooking in the kitchen, even sleeping. The officer reassured me that there was no sign the person was still around, but that wasn't comforting. Someone had been watching me so closely, tracking my every move, and I hadn't even noticed. I asked if they had any leads on who it could have been, but they didn't. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to identify the intruder. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. That night, as I lay awake at Rachel's, I kept thinking about the sketches. How long had they been watching me? And why? Those were questions I knew I'd never get answers to. Even after I moved into a new apartment on the other side of town, the paranoia stayed with me. I double-checked every lock, inspected every closet, and jumped at every unexpected noise. Therapy helped a bit, but the lingering fear never truly left. About a month ago, I got a strange package in the mail. There was no return address, just my name scrawled on the front in messy handwriting. My heart sank as I opened it, hands trembling. Inside was a single item, the same piece of paper I'd found in the wall with the sketch of my bedroom. There was no note, no explanation, just that silent, haunting reminder. I called the police immediately, but there was nothing they could do. No prints, no leads. Again, whoever it was had disappeared without a trace. I don't know if they're still watching me or if this was their way of saying goodbye. All I know is that I can't shake the feeling that they're not finished. Every time I step into my apartment, I scan the room, expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. I've changed everything about my life. My routine, my locks, even my phone number, but no matter what I do, I can't escape the fear. Whoever they were, they left more than just physical evidence behind. They left a part of themselves with me, and I'm terrified it's only a matter of time before they come back. Story 3. The Street Vendor's Warning. I'm not the kind of person who believes in superstitions or paranormal stuff. My husband, Mike, and I live in a small suburban town, and life was pretty mundane last December when this happened. We were preparing for the holidays, running around trying to make everything perfect. Mike and I had just moved into our first home earlier that year, and we were determined to make it feel festive. We decided to check out the local market, a place with stalls full of handmade crafts, candles, and holiday decorations. I remember the smell of roasted chestnuts in the air and the faint sound of carolers singing in the distance. It was one of those crisp winter evenings when the chill made your breath visible, and the market lights gave everything a warm glow. At one stall, an older man was selling ornaments. His setup was simple. No flashy signs, just a table covered with neatly arranged decorations. There was something odd about him, though. He had piercing eyes that seemed to study you, not in a friendly way, but like he could see something you couldn't. As we picked out a set of hand-painted wooden stars, he asked, almost casually, "Your house? Does it feel heavy sometimes?" I laughed, thinking he was making small talk, but before I could answer, he added, "You should be careful. Bad energy clings to places. Decorations can invite it or push it away." Mike and I exchanged a glance, unsure if he was joking or being serious. Then he handed us the bag with the ornaments and said, "Use these wisely. Not everything likes to stay in the dark." It was creepy, but we brushed it off, assuming he was just a quirky old man trying to add some mystique to his sales pitch. We got home that evening, still laughing about the vendor's odd warning. I mean, who even says stuff like that? Mike joked that we should sage the house, and I rolled my eyes. Our house had never felt weird to me. Sure, it was old, but it had charm. We hung the wooden stars in the living room above the fireplace, proud of how they added to the cozy holiday vibe. That first night, everything seemed normal, but looking back, there were small things I ignored. For instance, the living room felt unusually cold, even with the heat cranked up. I thought it was just a draft from the old windows, so I threw on a blanket and didn't give it a second thought. The next morning, I woke up to find one of the stars on the floor. It had fallen from the mantel. When I picked it up, I noticed the hook hadn't broken, which was strange. It was like someone had lifted it off and placed it there. I told Mike, and he shrugged, saying I must not have hung it securely. That evening, as we sat watching a Christmas movie, we both heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the hallway. At first, we thought it might be the wind or the pipes, but it had a rhythm like deliberate knocks. Mike got up to check, but when he opened the door to the hallway, it was silent. "Old house noises," he said, trying to reassure me, but I could tell he was a little uneasy too. The tapping became a nightly occurrence. It was always faint, always coming from the same part of the house, the hallway leading to the bedrooms. By the third night, Mike started making jokes about our ghostly house guest, but I could tell it was starting to bother him too. I tried to shake it off, but something about the sound felt wrong. It wasn't random, like creaky floors or shifting wood. It felt intentional. I started avoiding the hallway after dark, rushing past it with a weird pit in my stomach. The stars above the mantel were still falling occasionally, even though I double-checked that they were securely hung. One of them even cracked when it hit the floor, leaving a jagged edge that looked almost like teeth. The worst part was that I started feeling watched. I'd be doing something mundane, washing dishes, folding laundry, and get this prickling sensation like eyes boring into my back. It wasn't just paranoia, it felt real. Once, while I was cleaning up after dinner, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, near the hallway. It was quick, like a shadow darting out of sight. My heart skipped a beat, but when I turned, nothing was there. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the dim light. But that night, as we were getting ready for bed, Mike stopped in his tracks, staring at the hallway. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I hadn't, but the look on his face scared me more than anything else so far. That night was the first time we both heard the same thing. Whispering. It was faint, so faint that at first I thought it was just the wind, but the words were distinct, though I couldn't make them out. Mike turned off the TV and we sat there in silence, straining to hear. The whispers came from the direction of the hallway. I felt frozen, my chest tightening as I realized the sound wasn't random. It rose and fell like a conversation we weren't meant to overhear. Mike grabbed a flashlight and stood up. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and tense. I wanted to argue, but my throat felt like it was closing. I just nodded, clutching the blanket like it could shield me from whatever was out there. He walked into the hallway, and for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floor. Then silence. "Mike?" I called out, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. When he finally came back, his face was pale. "There's nothing there," he said, but he looked shaken. He didn't sit back down. Instead, he checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. I asked him what he thought it was, and he just shook his head. "Probably just the wind or something," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe it any more than I did. That night, I barely slept, every creak of the house sending my heart racing. The next day, I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just our nerves. I even joked to Mike that maybe the vendor had cursed us for not taking his warning seriously. He laughed, but it was forced, and I could tell he was still on edge. That afternoon, I decided to distract myself by baking cookies. The kitchen was warm and smelled like cinnamon, which helped me feel a little more normal. As I reached for a tray in the cabinet, I heard a thud behind me. When I turned around, one of the wooden stars was lying on the floor again. This time, I had left it on the mantel securely before starting in the kitchen. My stomach dropped. I picked it up, and when I touched it, the wood felt icy, like it had been sitting outside in the cold. That evening, we noticed something even stranger. One of the bulbs in the hallway light fixture started flickering, casting weird shadows on the walls. Mike grabbed a stepladder to check it, muttering something about old wiring, but as soon as he touched the bulb, the flickering stopped. "See? Nothing to worry about," he said, but as he climbed down, the light went out completely, plunging the hallway into darkness. We both froze. That's when I saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible outline of something standing at the end of the hallway. It wasn't solid, more like a distortion in the air, but it was unmistakably shaped like a person. I grabbed Mike's arm, my nails digging into his skin. "Do you see that?" I whispered. His face told me he did. We didn't move for what felt like forever, just staring at the end of the hallway. The figure, or whatever it was, didn't move either. It just stood there, silent and still, but the air around it felt wrong. It was heavy, pressing down on my chest like I couldn't take a full breath. Mike finally snapped out of it and stepped forward, calling out, "Who's there?" His voice cracked a little, which made my stomach turn even more. The second he spoke, the figure dissolved, like smoke dissipating into the air. The hallway was empty again, but the feeling didn't leave. Mike turned on every light in the house after that, and we sat in the living room, neither of us saying much. I think we were both trying to convince ourselves that we hadn't really seen what we thought we had. That night, the whispers returned. This time they weren't faint. They were louder, clearer, and definitely coming from the hallway. I couldn't make out full sentences, but I heard fragments. "Shouldn't have," "can't stay," "it's here now." I pulled the blanket over my head like a scared kid, but it didn't help. Mike was sitting up in bed, clutching his phone like he was about to call someone. But who do you even call for this? The whispers stopped suddenly, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Then we heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming straight toward our bedroom door. Mike jumped up and slammed the door shut, pressing his back against it. "This isn't normal," he said, his voice shaking. Neither of us slept that night. Mike kept the bat next to the bed and I stayed wide awake, listening for any sound. By morning, the house felt eerily calm, like whatever had happened the night before had been erased. But I knew it wasn't over. The stars were the first thing I checked, and sure enough, another one had fallen. This time I noticed something new. The cracked edge of the star wasn't just jagged, it looked like a pattern, almost like a symbol carved into the wood. I showed Mike and he stared at it for a long time before saying, "We need to get rid of these." He started gathering them up, but I hesitated. A part of me wondered if throwing them out would make things worse, like we'd be breaking some unspoken rule. We decided to take the stars back to the vendor. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a horror movie, but at that point I was willing to try anything to make it stop. The market was bustling again, just like the first night, but when we got to the vendor's stall, he wasn't there. His table was gone, and it was like he'd never existed. I asked one of the nearby vendors if they'd seen him, and she gave me a confused look. "There's no one like that here," she said. My stomach dropped. "No one?" "He was right here a few days ago," I insisted, but she just shook her head. Mike and I stood there, clutching the bag of stars, completely at a loss. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The bag felt lighter. When I opened it, 2 of the stars were missing. Mike and I didn't say much on the drive home. I think we were both trying to process what had just happened, or rather, what hadn't happened. The vendor was gone, 2 of the stars had vanished, and we were left with no answers. By the time we got back to the house, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like we were walking into something waiting for us. I tried to shake it off and focus on what we could do next. "Let's just burn them," Mike said, gesturing to the remaining stars. It felt drastic, but after everything I agreed. We took the stars out to the backyard, threw them into the fire pit, and lit a match. At first, nothing happened. The wood was stubborn, refusing to catch, but then all at once, the flames roared to life. As the stars burned, the air around us shifted. It was subtle at first, like a change in pressure, but then the wind picked up, howling around the yard despite the otherwise still night. The fire sputtered and hissed as if the wood was alive, fighting against the flames. I swear I heard faint whispers coming from the pit, though Mike later swore he didn't hear anything. The flames eventually died down, and all that was left were ashes. For the first time in days, the house felt still. There were no whispers, no cold drafts, no strange shadows. We went to bed that night cautiously optimistic that whatever had been haunting us was gone. I finally let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, it was over. The next few days were quiet. The tapping, the whispers, and the oppressive feeling of being watched, all of it had stopped. Mike and I started to feel like ourselves again, laughing about how we'd let a few creepy coincidences get to us. We even decorated the house more, putting up lights and garlands. But something still nagged at me. The vendor's warning, the way he'd said, "Not everything likes to stay in the dark," kept playing in my mind. I couldn't help but wonder if we'd actually gotten rid of whatever it was, or if it had just moved on. I wanted to let it go, but late at night, when the house was quiet, I found myself listening for whispers that weren't there. It wasn't until a week later that I noticed the photo. It was a picture of Mike and me from last Christmas, framed and sitting on the mantel where the stars had been. At first glance, it looked normal, but when I picked it up, I felt my stomach drop. In the background, faint but unmistakable, was a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. I hadn't noticed it before, and I was sure it hadn't been there when the picture was taken. I called Mike over, and his face went pale as he looked at it. "What does this mean?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He didn't answer, just turned the frame face down on the mantel. We haven't spoken about it since, but I keep the photo hidden in a drawer, unable to throw it away but too afraid to look at it again. Even now, sometimes at night, I catch myself glancing at that corner of the room, expecting to see something that isn't there, or maybe something that always has been. Story 4. The Vanishing Tenant. I've always been the kind of person who values peace and quiet. My wife, Jenna, and I bought our house in a small town 5 years ago. It's nothing fancy, just a 3-bedroom with a yard big enough for our 2 kids, Mason and Ellie, to run around. We'd always gotten by just fine, but earlier this year, a few unexpected expenses started piling up. Jenna suggested we rent out the spare room, something neither of us had ever done before. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of a stranger in our home, but the extra money would help us get back on track. After a few weeks of posting the ad online, we met a man named Greg. Greg was quiet and polite, the kind of tenant you hope for when you're sharing a space. He looked to be in his late 30s, with an average build and dark hair that always seemed slightly unkempt. He didn't talk much about himself, but that didn't seem strange at first. Some people just keep to themselves. He had a job in IT, or so he said, and he paid his rent on time. For the first month, everything was perfectly normal. But looking back, I realize now how little we actually knew about him. At first, having Greg around was barely noticeable. He left early in the morning, came back late at night, and spent most of his time in his room. He never complained, didn't make much noise, and barely used the common areas. The kids didn't seem to pay him any mind, and Jenna appreciated the extra income. If anything, he seemed like the perfect tenant. But after about 6 weeks, things started to feel off. There wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. I'd catch him glancing at us during dinner if he happened to pass by the kitchen, or I'd hear his door creak open late at night when the house was completely silent. I chalked it up to paranoia. I mean, the guy was a loner, sure, but that didn't make him dangerous. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Then one evening, Jenna mentioned something that made my stomach drop. She'd gone into the laundry room and found one of her scarves, one she hadn't worn in weeks, stuffed behind the washing machine. It was odd but not outright alarming. Still, it stuck with me. That same night, I decided to peek into Greg's room while he was out. It wasn't something I was proud of, but I felt like I needed some kind of reassurance that we weren't making a mistake letting him live there. The door was unlocked and everything looked ordinary at first. A bed, a desk, a suitcase in the corner. But then I noticed something strange. On his desk, there was a small stack of photos partially hidden under a notebook. I hesitated for a moment before pulling the photos out. What I saw made my chest tighten. They were pictures of us, Jenna, Mason, Ellie, and me, taken from odd angles around the house. There was one of Mason playing in the backyard, another of Jenna folding laundry in the living room. But the worst was a picture of me taken from outside the kitchen window while I was washing dishes. I could even see my reflection in the glass. My hands started shaking as I flipped through them. Some were grainy, like they'd been taken at night, while others were oddly crisp, like he'd been standing just a few feet away. I shoved the photos back where I found them and hurried out of his room, trying to convince myself there had to be some kind of explanation. I didn't tell Jenna right away. I didn't know how. What was I supposed to say? Hey, our tenant might be secretly photographing us? Instead, I decided to keep an eye on him. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I'd overlooked before. He was always so deliberate in how he moved, how he spoke. When he came into the kitchen for coffee one morning, I swear his eyes lingered on Mason just a second too long. That night, I told Jenna everything. At first, she thought I was overreacting, but when I showed her the photos, her face went pale. "We need to get him out of here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Now. The next day, I confronted Greg. I waited until Jenna and the kids were out of the house, just in case things got heated. When he came home from work, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the stack of photos in front of me. He froze the second he saw them, and for the first time, I noticed something in his expression. Fear. "Care to explain this?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the room like he was looking for an escape route. Finally, he muttered, "I can't." His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. "You need to leave," I said, standing up. "Tonight." To my surprise, he didn't argue. He nodded, grabbed his jacket, and walked out the front door without another word. Part of me wanted to follow him to make sure he didn't come back, but something about his reaction left me frozen. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge. Around 2 a.m., I got up to check the locks for the 5th time when I noticed something on the floor by the front door. There was a single photograph face down. My hands were trembling as I picked it up and turned it over. It was a picture of Ellie, asleep in her bed, taken from the doorway of her room. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I ran to check on Ellie, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. She was still there, sleeping peacefully, her favorite stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. But the thought that Greg had been in her room, standing there while she slept, made my stomach churn. I woke Jenna and showed her the photo. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "We need to call the police." And that's exactly what we did. 2 officers arrived about 20 minutes later, and I handed over the photos and told them everything. The officers took it seriously, which was a relief, but there wasn't much they could do. "We'll file a report and keep an eye out for him," one of them said, though his tone wasn't exactly reassuring. Greg hadn't technically committed a crime that they could prove. The photos were creepy, sure, but they weren't illegal. The officer's partner suggested we change the locks and install cameras, which we did the very next day. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. For weeks, every creak of the house or flicker of light outside sent me into high alert. I felt like a stranger in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder. About a month later, just as life was starting to feel normal again, Jenna called me at work, her voice shaking. "He's back," she said, barely above a whisper. I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean he's back?" She explained that when she went to take out the trash, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods behind our house. "I think it was Greg," she said. "He didn't move. He just stood there watching." I told her to lock all the doors and call the police while I rushed home. By the time I got there, the police had already swept the area, but they hadn't found anyone. Jenna was visibly shaken, and Mason and Ellie were confused, asking why there were officers at the house again. I didn't have the heart to explain. That night, I sat up in the living room, clutching a baseball bat and staring out the window. Hours passed without incident, but just as I started to doze off, I heard a faint tapping sound. My blood ran cold. It was coming from the back door. I crept toward the kitchen, bat in hand, and peeked through the curtains. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I spotted it. Another photograph taped to the glass. My hands were shaking as I opened the door to grab it. This time, it was a picture of all of us sitting at the dining table, taken from the woods. It wasn't recent. It had to have been from weeks ago. But the fact that he'd kept it and brought it back sent a clear message. He was still watching. That was the final straw. The next morning, I packed up Jenna and the kids and sent them to stay with her parents a few towns over. I stayed behind to deal with the house and figure out what to do next. I wasn't going to let Greg, or whoever this man really was, drive us out of our own home without a fight. I installed motion-activated floodlights around the perimeter, set up cameras inside and outside, and even bought a heavy-duty deadbolt for the back door. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of control. But deep down, I was still uneasy. The photos, the lurking, it all felt deliberate, like a game he was playing. That night, I stayed up watching the security feed, half expecting him to show up. The hours ticked by with nothing out of the ordinary. But around 3 a.m., the motion light in the backyard flicked on. My heart raced as I checked the camera feed. At first, the screen was empty, just the glow of the yard illuminated by the light. But then, just on the edge of the frame, I saw him. Greg, or someone who looked just like him, standing there in the shadows. He wasn't moving, just staring straight at the camera. His face was expressionless, but his presence felt almost taunting. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed my phone and called the police, praying they'd get there in time. The police arrived within 10 minutes, but by the time they got there, Greg was gone. They searched the yard and the surrounding area but came up empty-handed again. One of the officers, a younger guy with a serious demeanor, pulled me aside and asked if I was sure it was him. It was him, I said firmly. I saw him on the camera, but when we reviewed the footage together, Greg's face wasn't there. The motion light came on just as I remembered, but the camera showed nothing but an empty yard. I stared at the screen, my mouth dry, trying to process what I was seeing. Was he somehow avoiding the cameras? Or had I imagined it in my exhaustion? The officers left shortly after, advising me to stay vigilant and call if anything else happened. The next morning, I made the decision to sell the house. I couldn't stay there, not after everything. Jenna and I agreed it wasn't worth the stress or the fear. We moved in with her parents temporarily while the house went on the market. To this day, I don't know how Greg disappeared so completely or what his real motives were. The photos were the most haunting part, evidence that he'd been watching us for weeks, even months, without us noticing. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if he's still out there watching another family, leaving behind the same trail of unsettling clues. I'll probably never know. But one thing's for sure, I'll never rent out a room in my home again. Story 5. The grocery store encounter. I was 24 at the time, living in a small town in the Midwest, working my first full-time job at a marketing agency. My days were a blur of emails, deadlines, and caffeine, but weekends were my sanctuary. That Saturday afternoon, I decided to hit the local grocery store, a cozy place just a few miles from my apartment. It wasn't a busy day. The store was the kind of quiet where you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant rattle of shopping carts. I wasn't in a rush, just picking up a few things: milk, some pasta, a loaf of sourdough bread. Honestly, it was just another routine errand. As I turned down the cereal aisle, I noticed a man standing a few feet away. He looked like he was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, with messy dark hair and a scruffy beard. His clothes were slightly wrinkled, like he'd grabbed whatever was cleanest off the floor that morning. When I reached for a box of granola, he smiled and said something like, "Good choice, healthy and tasty." I laughed politely, thinking it was just a passing comment. He seemed harmless, even kind, and we ended up chatting for a few minutes. His name was Mark, and he joked about how he always ended up buying too many snacks when he came to the store hungry. There was something disarming about him, an easy, laid-back demeanor that made me let my guard down. After a few minutes of chatting, I finished up in the aisle and started moving toward the checkout lanes. To my surprise, Mark showed up behind me in line, his cart only half full. "You're a quick shopper," he joked, gesturing to my small basket. I smiled politely, brushing it off as coincidence. As I was bagging my groceries, he walked over again. "Hey, you've got quite a bit there. Need help carrying it to your car?" he offered. I hesitated for a moment but figured there was no harm. My arms were already full, and it was broad daylight in a parking lot with other people around. "Sure, thanks," I said, feeling a bit awkward but grateful for the help. We walked out together, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. I pointed out my car, and he carried a couple of my bags while we made small talk about the weather and how the store always seemed understaffed. Once the bags were in the trunk, I thanked him and expected the conversation to end there. But as I got into the driver's seat, he leaned against the door, smiling. "Hey, I'd love to grab coffee sometime. You seem like good company." The directness caught me off guard. I stammered something about being busy with work and needing to go. He nodded, stepping back, but there was an odd flicker in his expression, something between disappointment and frustration. I drove off, feeling a strange tension settle in my chest, but I tried to shrug it off. I didn't think much of it until I glanced in my rearview mirror about 10 minutes later. A dark sedan, one I hadn't noticed before, was following a few cars behind me. At first I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just a coincidence, plenty of people drove that route. But when I turned onto a smaller street closer to my apartment, the car turned too. My heart began to race and I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it wasn't the same car. Maybe it was just someone going in the same direction. Still, the unease gnawed at me. I decided to test my theory and made an unnecessary left turn into a random residential neighborhood. Sure enough, the sedan followed, lagging just far enough back to seem inconspicuous. My stomach dropped. My mind immediately jumped to Mark, and I cursed myself for being so naive. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, I tried to think. My apartment was only a few blocks away, but there was no way I was going straight home now. I didn't want whoever was behind me knowing where I lived. Instead, I looped through another neighborhood, hoping to lose him, but every time I made a turn, the sedan mirrored it. Panic was setting in, and I could feel my palms sweating against the steering wheel. My heart thudded so loudly in my chest it felt like it might drown out my thoughts. I remembered hearing once that if you think you're being followed, you should drive to a public place. So, I headed toward the busiest part of town, where there were coffee shops and a gas station that was always full of people. I kept glancing in the mirror, hoping the car would give up and turn off. But it didn't. It stayed just far enough behind me to avoid suspicion from anyone else, but close enough that I couldn't shake the feeling I was being hunted. When I finally pulled into the gas station, I parked near the entrance, right under the bright floodlights. My fingers trembled as I pretended to fiddle with my phone, watching from the corner of my eye. The sedan didn't pull into the lot. Instead, it slowed down and crept past like whoever was inside was scanning the area. For a moment, I thought they might just keep driving and I'd finally be free of this nightmare. But then, further down the street, I saw the car make a U-turn. It parked across from the station, just barely visible in the shadows. Whoever it was, they were waiting. I felt trapped. My safe, small-town world had suddenly become something out of a thriller movie, and I had no idea what to do next. I didn't want to sit there and wait for whoever was in that car to make the next move. I scanned the gas station for anyone who might help. A couple of teenagers filling up their car, an older man with a cowboy hat talking to the cashier inside. My instinct told me to stay where there were people, so I got out of my car and went into the convenience store. My hands were still shaking as I pretended to browse the shelves, keeping one eye on the window. The sedan hadn't moved. After a few minutes, I decided to talk to the cashier. "Hey, this is going to sound weird," I said, my voice low so no one else would hear. "I think someone's following me." The cashier, a guy in his early 20s with a bored expression, straightened up a bit. "Are you serious?" he asked, his tone shifting to concern. I nodded, glancing toward the car parked across the street. "That car out there. It's been following me since I left the grocery store." He leaned over the counter to look out the window and frowned. "You want me to call the cops?" The idea both reassured and terrified me. What if I was overreacting? But deep down, I knew I wasn't. "Yeah," I said finally, "I think you should." While the cashier dialed the police, I stood by the counter trying to calm my breathing. My eyes kept darting to the car across the street, which still hadn't moved. The minutes felt like hours. I started second-guessing myself. What if it wasn't Mark? What if I was just imagining things? But then, as if to confirm my worst fears, the car's headlights flicked on for a split second before going dark again. It was like they wanted me to know they were still watching. My stomach churned and I felt a wave of nausea. The cashier handed me the phone. "They want to talk to you," he said, his voice steady but serious. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, giving them a description of the car and its location. She told me to stay inside and wait for an officer to arrive. "Don't leave the store," she said firmly. As I hung up, I felt a bit of relief knowing help was on the way, but the fear didn't fully subside. I walked toward the back of the store to put some distance between me and the windows, pretending to browse snacks while keeping one eye on the door. Just then, the bell above the entrance jingled and my heart stopped. I froze, expecting to see Mark, or whoever was in that car, but it was just one of the teenagers from the gas pump. I let out a shaky breath, but the tension didn't leave my body. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car reflected through the store's windows. Relief flooded me as I watched the cruiser pull into the gas station. An officer, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped out and made his way toward the entrance. I rushed to meet him, explaining everything in a frantic, breathless rush. The car following me, the odd U-turn, and how it was still parked across the street. He nodded, his expression calm but serious, and asked me to stay inside while he checked it out. I watched through the window as he walked toward the sedan, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. The moment he approached the car, the engine roared to life. The sedan sped off, tires screeching as it turned sharply down the street. The officer sprinted back to his cruiser and took off after it, leaving me and the cashier staring at each other in stunned silence. My heart was racing again, but this time it was mixed with frustration. Who was this person? Why had they been following me? And why did they flee as soon as the officer confronted them? I stayed in the store, pacing and replaying every detail in my mind, waiting for some kind of resolution. About 20 minutes later, the police officer returned to the gas station. His cruiser's lights were still flashing, and his expression was grim as he walked inside. "We lost them," he said, shaking his head. "They were driving recklessly and managed to slip away. But we got a partial plate number and we're running it now." I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that the officer believed me and was taking it seriously, but dread at the thought that whoever was following me might still be out there. He asked me a few more questions about the car and the man I had met at the grocery store, jotting everything down in his notebook. Then he said something that sent a chill through me. "We've had a couple of similar reports in this area over the past month," he explained. "People being followed, suspicious cars. Most of them haven't led to anything concrete, but..." He trailed off, clearly trying not to alarm me further. "Do you have a safe place to stay tonight?" he asked. I nodded, though the truth was I didn't feel safe anywhere at that moment. The officer offered to escort me home, and I gratefully accepted. As I followed his cruiser back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Something about the whole situation didn't add up. When I got back to my apartment, the officer waited in his cruiser until I was safely inside. I double-checked all the locks on my doors and windows, even drawing the curtains, though I wasn't sure it would make much of a difference. My apartment, which usually felt like a cozy haven, now felt too exposed, too vulnerable. I sat on the couch with the lights off, peeking out occasionally to make sure the street was clear. The officer eventually drove off, and the silence that followed was deafening. I told myself I was overthinking it, but my gut wouldn't let me relax. Later that night, curiosity got the better of me. I started searching online, trying to find out more about recent incidents in my area. After digging through local news sites and forums, I stumbled upon a post that made my blood run cold. It was from a woman in the next town over, describing how a man had followed her from a grocery store just weeks ago. Her description of the car, a dark sedan, matched the one that had followed me. She mentioned the man introducing himself as Mark and offering to help with her bags. But what truly unsettled me was the final detail. She'd found out he had a criminal record, including stalking and harassment charges. My hands shook as I read, the pieces falling into place. I couldn't sleep after that. Every creak and groan of my apartment building sounded like someone outside my door. I replayed my interaction with Mark in my head, trying to recall every detail. His tone, his body language, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. How had I missed the signs? I debated calling the police again to tell them what I'd found, but part of me wondered if it would even help. They already had the partial plate number. What more could I add? Still, I felt the need to do something. Sitting there, alone and terrified, wasn't an option. The next morning, I decided to take some precautions. I went to the hardware store and bought extra locks for my doors and a security camera for the front entrance. Installing them made me feel a little more in control, but the fear lingered. I also called the police station to share the post I'd found online. The officer I spoke to thanked me and assured me they were looking into it. That afternoon, I got a call back. "We tracked down the owner of the car," the officer said. "He matches the description you gave us, and we're bringing him in for questioning." Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with a nagging thought. What if it wasn't over? What if there were more people like him out there, watching and waiting? A few days passed, and I didn't hear anything more from the police. I tried to go about my normal routine, but everything felt different now. I avoided the grocery store entirely and took different routes to work each day, constantly checking my rearview mirror. Even at home, I couldn't fully relax. I'd installed the security camera by my front door and found myself compulsively checking the live feed, especially at night. It felt like paranoia, but I couldn't shake the sense that someone might still be out there waiting for the right moment. Then one evening the officer called me again. "We've confirmed it was the same man from your description," he said. "Turns out he's been on our radar for a while. He's got a history of following women, but this is the first time we've had solid evidence tying him to specific incidents." I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. Relief that they'd caught him, but anger at the fact that someone like him had been free to terrorize people for so long. "What happens now?" I asked. The officer explained that charges would be filed, but he couldn't promise how long the process would take. In the meantime, he added, "Stay cautious. People like him don't always stop, even when they're caught." That night, I allowed myself a moment of relief, but it was brief. Knowing he'd been caught didn't erase the fear that had settled deep in my bones. The thought that someone like Mark could slip through the cracks so easily, charming his way into people's lives, made me realize how vulnerable I'd been. I decided to share my story online, not just to vent, but to warn others. I posted everything on a local community forum, including the details about Mark, the car, and what had happened to me. To my shock, several women commented, sharing eerily similar experiences. Some had been approached by him at parks, others at stores, all with the same friendly, disarming demeanor. It was chilling to think how many times he'd gotten away with it. Even now, months later, I still feel the weight of that day. I've made changes, moved to a different part of town, signed up for self-defense classes, and learned to trust my instincts more. The fear doesn't go away entirely, but I've learned to live with it. What stays with me the most is how ordinary it all seemed at first, how easy it was for someone like Mark to blend into the fabric of everyday life. If there's one thing I've learned, it's to never ignore that uneasy feeling in your gut. It might just save your life.